We continue with our sermon series entitled Power Belongs to God. Today we want to look at the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 32, which reads, "And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph." I'd like to preach from this thought today, reaching back in order to reach forward. In this 24th chapter of Joshua, Joshua has gathered Israel together and rehearsing to them all of the things that God has done for them. He goes back to the time of the call of Abraham, even before the call of Abraham. And he points out to them that there was a time when their forefathers served idol gods, strange gods, but that God had called Abram out of that environment and called him to walk with God to a life of holiness and sanctification. He goes on to rehearse the greatness of God in the history of the children of Israel, so much so that this is why they are now where they are. They're in a land where they have begun to subdue, to conquer it, the land that had been promised to their forefathers, living in cities that they did not build, enjoying the produce of the land that they did not have to plant. And so that God has demonstrated himself to be powerful in how he has brought them from the time of the call of Abraham through the time of their wandering in the wilderness and now here into the promised land to possess it. He then says to them, "Put away the strange gods that caused your forefathers to stumble." He says this, "Now choose you this day whom you will serve." And you know what Joshua's statement was, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This 24th chapter then records the death of Joshua. But before it transitions into the book of Judges, this 32nd verse, this 32nd verse of the 24th chapter, we are given. And anytime that God gives us something, church, is for a reason, and we ought to pay attention to it. Now, it may seem initially somewhat innocuous that verse appears there, but I do believe that if we would labor to find out the significance, then it will be a blessing unto us. Well, it just simply says this, that the bones of Joseph that they brought with them out of Egypt, they buried there in the promised land. What was the origin then of this burying of Joseph? Well, if we will go back to the book of Genesis, you will recall that God calls Abraham, then through Isaac, then through Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. He established his covenant. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, and Rachel was Joseph's mother. Joseph was a dreamer, and he shared his dream with his brethren. His brethren, though, did not appreciate the dreams that Joseph was sharing, and therefore they were jealous. They sell him into servitude. He goes down into Egypt, and though not everything would go Joseph's way initially, yet God is with him. And as a result of God being with him, God elevates him to second in command in the country of Egypt. And a famine arises such that there's grain in Egypt, but in Canaan there's famine. And so the end result is that Jacob packs up the family and moves them into Egypt, where Joseph cares for them. Joseph sends for them that he may take care of them. Eventually, the time comes where Jacob dies, and the sons take him back to Canaan to bury him, and then they return to Egypt to live. The time then comes when Joseph must die. And in Genesis chapter number 50, verse 24 and 25, we find that Jacob After he's been buried, now Joseph is preparing to die. Joseph causes his brethren to take an oath. He tells them that he knows that God is going to visit them because God has made promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them the land of Canaan, that God will visit them. And that when God does so, Joseph says this, ye shall carry up my bones from hence. Joseph makes the request that in that time when God visits and sets his people free, that then he wants to have his bones carried. Well, someone would ask the question, well, why didn't Joseph simply allow them to take him when he died and bury him in Canaan, as they did Jacob, his father? Well, I do believe God is at work, church, and you can always know that God is at work. Amen. Joseph is, he dies, he's embalmed and entombed in Egypt. Well, now, a few days pass, more like several hundred years pass. About 400 years go by from the time of Joseph's death until God has now sent Moses, raised up Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Now, notice this in Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, as they are now ready to exit Egypt. Remember, God has shown himself strong and powerful in behalf of his people. Yes, he has plagued Egypt, and now Pharaoh is going to let them go. And as they are preparing to exit Egypt, Exodus 13, verse 19 said this, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. So now, after 400 years, Moses remembers, and I do believe that God helped him to remember, from it having been passed down from generation to generation, this Joseph, this thing that Joseph had requested. Now remember, there's a verse back there in Exodus, there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, nor the good that Joseph had done. So now there's been a changing of the guard of the Pharaohs of Egypt, and yet God is going to still honor that which he was doing through Joseph in the generations yet to come. Don't miss that. So now they're ready to head up out of Egypt during the Exodus. It is clear they take the bones with them. Now you know that they wander about 40 years in the wilderness, and yet the bones are with them. Moses transitioned. Joshua takes the lead to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. They enter and they begin to subdue the land. So time passed. Now when we get to chapter number 24, we're told that Joshua is ready to die, but it mentions that the bones were actually buried in Canaan land. Don't miss it. It's significant because the lesson that we can learn is that God made the children of Israel stay connected to what he had done previously. See, the carrying around of those bones weren't simply, they just needed to carry bones around in the wilderness for 40 years. Remembering to take the bones was not just simply, well, we just going to take his bones with us. No, it was by divine providence. And I believe that the message, one of the lessons that we learn is that it is important for us to look back and to reach back into our past so that we can fully reach our future. Amen. Our present, where we are, and yet we also have a future. Well, the bones of Joseph, when they are carrying those bones, when they remember to take those bones, it is parallel to us remembering the work and the labor of those who've gone on before us. And while we don't physically carry their bones, yet we remember what God did through them. And by the power of God that he worked through them, we can have some confidence and assurance that the same God who helped them will help us too. So yes, we ought to be able to reach back in order to reach forward. Some old songs, some old hymns of the church that we ought to never forget. We ought to reach back and sing Amazing Grace. We ought to reach back and continue to sing, Father, I stretch my hand to thee. Well, some of the contemporary artists may think that those songs are old bones of Joseph that don't need to be carried around. But I would submit to you that we ought to sing those songs with the fervor of God, knowing that God brought our foreparents through and God will bring us through. Amen. Can I get a witness to that? Yes, power belongs to God. They weren't just carrying bones, but the burying of the bones in Canaan land demonstrates that if we will trust God and allow God to help us to properly reach back in order to reach forward, that we'll find out that he's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. Amen. May God bless you and keep you is our prayer.